Emily viene de Portland también. Y igual que Matías, la charla que propuso estaba tan chévere que aceptamos a Emily de vuelta. Emily presentó last year un workshop. Y esta vez hizo una charla que estuvo muy chévere, entonces traemos a Emily nuevamente. Un aplauso para Emily, por favor.
Hello, everybody. I had to put a Stranger Things gif in this because I've been like binge watching it all week. It's really helped me prepare for my talk. I'm going to talk today a little bit about the history of the disability rights movement and how the architecture industry reacted to laws around accessibility and how we can learn from this in the tech industry. So the history portion is mostly focused around the disability rights movement in the United States, but I think that some of the mistakes that we've made are globally applicable. And I've also included a little bit of Colombian history as well. And then at the end, I'll give you all some concrete steps for getting accessibility implemented at your company. So yeah, I'm Emily Plummer. I work at Buffer. I'm a front-end engineer. I mostly work in JavaScript, specifically with React Redux, and I've been leading accessibility at my company for the past year or so. In my spare time, I also run a flower farm in Oregon, in the Willamette Valley. It's a nice change of pace from tech. So I started getting interested in accessibility a few years ago when I attended the Global Accessibility Awareness Day. And I got to hear firsthand from people how impactful an accessible web can be on the lives of everyday people. And I also realized that as developers, we're the ones who have this incredible power to make that happen. So since then, I've been reading up on accessibility, and I'd love to share some of the ideas I found along the way. So let's go back a little bit. The wheelchair was invented in 300 BC in China, where records show wheelbarrow-type furniture was used to mobilize people with disabilities. And disability activism has existed in the United States well before the 20th century, but it began to build a ton of momentum after World War II because a lot of veterans were coming home from war with disabilities, and they couldn't access the services that they were promised as veterans by the government. So one notable activist who we'll come back to later is Ed Roberts. This is him right here. He was a student at UC Berkeley in the 60s, and he was a pioneer in the field of disability activism. When he first applied to UC Berkeley, they actually told him that he wouldn't be admitted because of his disability, but he and his family pushed back, and he eventually was able to attend. But then when he showed up, they said that he had to live in the hospital because the dorms couldn't accommodate wheelchairs. So he did, and he ended up forming a group on campus called the Rolling Quads, which was made up of other students who were also living in the hospital. And they pressured the university to implement barrier-free measures for students with disabilities, and this actually spread all across the United States during that time. And one of the coolest things that he organized was this middle-of-the-night renovation of the campus pathways, where they literally stomped down curbs and laid asphalt to create ramps so students could navigate throughout the campus. So this group of students eventually formed the Center for Independent Living, which advocated for this idea that was actually really radical, that instead of putting people with disabilities in nursing homes and assisted living facilities, instead society should adapt and remove barriers so that these people could lead independent lives. And this idea led to the passing of the Architectural Barriers Act, which was the first major piece of legislation that afforded people with disabilities access rights, and it meant that any federal public building had to be accessible. So once this was passed, architects were forced to start thinking about making buildings accessible. But to do this, they oftentimes just kind of like plastered on an ugly ramp, or they would put a separate entrance for wheelchair users at a different part of the building. And everybody could indeed gain access, but these add-ons were expensive, they were unsightly, and a lot of times they created this sense of othering. Like, you imagine you show up to a concert with some friends and you have to go around the back to get in just because you're in a wheelchair. That kind of sucks. So accessibility really wasn't built into the design at all. It was a total afterthought. And I think that's pretty lazy. I think we can learn a huge lesson from this because I feel like I'm seeing this a lot right now in tech, where a site is built without accessibility in mind, and then later down the road, a company might get a customer support message, or they'll hire an engineer who really cares about it, or they might hire someone who has a disability, and then they decide that they want to make their website accessible. And at this point, it's already fully built out, and I'm sure all of us here have worked in legacy code bases. We know that it's not very fun. It's harder to go in and fix something than to just do it right the first time around. So I think we need to start changing the status quo around accessibility and not view it as a bug, but view it as a part of our workflow. Because you wouldn't deploy a website to your users and then later on go back in and add action handlers or add CSS. So I think that we should think about accessibility the same way. It's broken for a lot of people if we don't do it right the first time. So this takes me back to the late 70s when the concept of universal design was introduced by architect Ronald Mace, and this kind of changed how architects were looking at accessibility. Universal design is the concept that spaces should be designed to be aesthetic and usable for all, and that it should blend in well for the design. And I'm going to talk about it a little bit, and I think this applies to the web not only in visual design, but also the kind of definition of design that is the way that you design your code, the way that you architect your code bases, the way that you decide to build out a feature. So, universal design not only meets the standards of accessibility set forth by whatever law is applicable in your country, but it also goes beyond them. So this differs from compliance-oriented design, which is what architects were first doing and is oftentimes what we're doing in tech right now, but it takes a holistic approach to design. And the idea is that by following universal design practices, you build something that's better for everyone in the end. That's kind of the main tenet, and I think we should leverage this on the web. There are a lot of really awesome examples of how universal design can make something even more beautiful. So one example, this is the Ed Roberts building at UC Berkeley. It's named after that same Ed Roberts who was leading those secret ramp building missions in the middle of the night. It's located right above a transit stop in the Bay Area, and it's one of the best examples of universal design that I could find. The building is really, really cool. The central feature is this beautiful ramp that you can see. Obviously, it's accessible. It also has this high contrast design, so people who have low vision can see that it's there, and it's easier to navigate throughout the rest of the building with that main central feature. It's also got 7-foot wide corridors everywhere, no matter what. It has motion sensor hands-free building controls. All of the restroom doors can be opened either by tapping a bar with your foot or tapping it with your wheelchair. Or there's a smartphone app, I guess. You can open it with your smartphone, which is really cool. And the coolest part is, this is a quote from their website. It's a multi-sensory wayfinding system, which includes a fountain on one end of the atrium that serves to assist people with sensory impairments. In hearing the pleasant sound of water flowing, individuals can orient themselves in the building and immediately know where they are in reference to the source of the sound. So that's really cool. I think I will always look at water features in a new way. I didn't realize that water features could actually be a way for people who have low vision to navigate. That's pretty awesome. And something that surprised me about this building is that it's so accessible that some people in the Bay Area actually take the train in from other parts of the city just to use the restroom, because it's the only restroom that they can actually access. And I think it's cool, because I think the building really stands on its own. I don't look at this building and think, oh, this was built for people with disabilities. I just think it looks like a really nice building. Another example of universal design is OXO, which is a popular kitchen tool company, and it was founded on the principles of universal design. If you go to their website later on tonight, you can read all about universal design and their philosophy. And these kitchen tools were originally invented because the founder, his wife had arthritis, and he noticed that she couldn't use a peeler. And so he didn't create a peeler for people with arthritis, he just improved the design of the peeler, and now everyone loves this new design, and it's a pretty successful company. So before I move on to the next section, I just wanted to mention a little bit about the history in Colombia. Colombia has actually set some really amazing examples for disability rights that I think a lot of other countries should follow. Colombia is the first, and I think still the only country that has purchased licenses for screen readers to its citizens for free of charge. So far, they've purchased over 70,000 screen readers, and they commit to purchasing a license for anyone who needs them. And these aren't cheap. Usually, screen reader licenses are around like $200, so it's pretty expensive. They've also set up these relay centers that provide free translation services for those with hearing or auditory impairments. And in 2014, 115,000 calls were placed through this service. So that's really cool. And it's all part of this Vive digital plan, which I know I didn't pronounce that right, but the plan aims to create jobs, improve economic growth, and reduce poverty through internet access and access to other digital services. So the government here realizes how crucial tech access is, and also realizes that access to everyone is really important, and they're doing it from the start. So I think that's really amazing. I wish that the United States would do the same thing. Because 10% of people who use the web need the website to be built with accessibility in mind in order to use it at all. So that's 1 out of every 10 users. That's a lot of people. I didn't realize how many people were affected by inaccessible websites. And I like to think about the example of if Amazon's add to cart button was broken for 1 out of every 10 people who wanted to buy something from them, it would be a super big deal. Some poor engineer would be pinged in the middle of the night. They'd have to get up and fix it. And I think we should think about accessibility in the same way. So this is kind of the quote that changed how I thought about accessibility, and it's that disability is a disconnect between people's abilities and the built environment. So if we think about it that way, we realize that disability only exists because we've designed the world to not accommodate everyone. And I like to think if everybody had wheels for feet, for one, it would be pretty awesome. But we just wouldn't have the concept of stairs because no one would have ever thought to design stairs. It just wouldn't make sense. And today in tech, I know a lot of web applications are built with this perfect potential user. We do all of this user testing and personas of this exact person we're building for. But when we do that, we oftentimes lose sight of people who, we also often lose sight of those who are disadvantaged by that kind of thinking. Because today, instead of going to one of those buildings that architects spent decades figuring out how to make accessible, people are going to the web to access services that they need. And in many ways, we have as much of an imperative to make our applications accessible as architects had to make their buildings accessible, and they still do. Because so much of our lives are built around the web. We pay taxes, we book hotels, we check our bank statements, we research our civil rights. I honestly don't know how I would function to use without the web. I grew up using the web. I'm obviously a millennial, so it's just part of me. I mean, if you think about all the ways that you use the web to get here today, everyone here bought a ticket online. Some of you might have used the web to book plane tickets or a hotel room. Some of you may even have used a ride-sharing app to get to the venue. You might have looked up the weather this morning to see if you needed a rain jacket. And the web is so ingrained into our daily lives that sometimes we don't realize how dependent we are on it until we can't navigate with it anymore. And it's essential to make sure that we're not creating this new built environment that's limiting people with disabilities even further. Because we are creating disability as developers if we aren't building software for everyone. So I think it's really important to keep in mind that what we do every day is really cool. We're part of creating this new world online where people are able to do things that they normally would have had to go into a physical building to do. And so it's important to take that responsibility really seriously and make sure that we're not creating disability along the way. I think the web is really exciting to me because I think it's this really great opportunity It's an opportunity to level the playing field for everyone. The web could be this amazing equalizer, but only if we're intentional about building applications for everyone. So with that in mind, I would love to arm you all with some concrete steps for getting accessibility thought about and fixed at your organization. This is by no means an end-all, be-all approach. It's just what worked for me and what hopefully will help you out as well. A lot of times when I talk about accessibility, afterwards people ask me, but yeah, how do I get like my manager to actually let me do this and spend time on this? Or like, what do I need to do to get started? So I'm hoping to kind of answer those questions. The first thing I would say to do is to get familiar with accessibility best practices. This will help you understand where your organization might need to improve, and it'll allow you to speak confidently about accessibility topics to your coworkers. There are so many great resources out there for getting started. I recommend the Teach Access course, which you can find on my resources page at the end of the talk. There's also a really great Slack channel that you can join that I really love. It's called Web-A11Y, and I've linked to that as well. There's just all kinds of, there's like hundreds of people in there that you can ask questions to. There's a lot of people in there who do have disabilities themselves that you can ask questions with, and everyone's really helpful, so. And then I'm gonna go over a few of the top like technical gotchas really quick before I move on to the next steps. But these are just kind of beginners, so hopefully the tutorials can help you fill in the rest. But the first thing is to make sure that everything a user can interact with on your website is focusable with a keyboard. So this is anything that helps your user navigate around the website, like tabs, these are buttons, toggles, controls, anything like that. Make sure that a user who's only using a keyboard or a screen reader can get to it. Another thing is to make sure that all inputs have labels. So if you have a form and it doesn't have any labels, a user on a screen reader won't know if the input is for a credit card number or for their last name. So this is really, really important. Making sure that you've got focus styles. I know a lot of designers like to ask developers to remove the outline in Chrome. It's that fancy CSS trick, outline none. That's okay, but only if you re-implement an outline that is visible for users and maybe goes better with your brand than the fuzzy blue stuff. So when I first started learning to code, semantic HTML was a really hot topic, and people were talking about it at conferences. And to be honest, I didn't really understand why it was so important. Like, I just kind of accepted it, but I was like, is it really that important? And the more that I learned about accessibility, I understood why. So HTML was built to comply with the accessibility API, and when we don't use HTML in the way it was intended to be used, we're making things inaccessible. The best example here, and I see it all the time, is that when people don't use the button element for things that should be buttons, instead they use like a div or a span, or I've even seen someone use a list item before. The button element has two really important features. The first one is that it gives context to the screen reader that the item can be focused. So a div is not focusable from a keyboard, like you just can't get to it. And then the second thing is that buttons have, they automatically trigger the on-click event. So divs and spans don't do that. So if you're not handling a click on an item, or if you are handling a click on an item, like a submit button or something like that, and it's a div, unless you hack the div in a weird way, nothing's going to happen. So just use your buttons. And then the last one is to learn how to use a screen reader. It's pretty easy. I think it's a great way to build empathy with your users because you'll find out really quickly what parts of your application are hard to get to or not navigable at all. So on Mac, you can just press Command F5. It's really easy. And if you're on a PC, you can try out a free trial of JAWS or NVDA. So the next step is getting your team on board, and this can oftentimes be the hardest step. This is what I get questions about the most. A lot of people don't understand how crucial accessibility is, so I would recommend having a one-on-one conversation with your manager or people higher up, maybe even go all the way up to the CTO.